So my guest today is Sir Paul Tucker, a former Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. Sir Paul spent most of his working life in the bank from 1980 to 2013. He started his career on the supervisory and operations side, covering such matters as banking supervision and financial stability. In 2002, he became a member of the Monetary Policy Committee, responsible for setting interest rates, which has been given the independence to decide on those interest rates some 4 years before by Gordon Brown when Chancellor of the Exchequer. From 2013, he has held fellowship positions at the Harvard Kennedy School and, I am pleased to say, is a visiting professor at the Global Governance Institute at UCL. Central bankers and other public servants do publish books, but few that I know of write works of political theory. But that is just what Sir Paul has done in his Unelected Power, published in 2018. Unelected Power seeks to bring Republican insights to bear on the principles by which independent agencies, like central banks, but also many others, are to be designed in modern democratic government. And it is those questions that we should be discussing today. Paul, thank you very much for joining me in this interview.
I'm delighted to be here. Thanks very much for inviting me, Albert.
Thank you. I want to begin with a very general question, if I may. As I said in the introduction, public servants do write books, but they often take the form of informed reflections about practical experience. Unelected Power, by contrast, does have some reflections on your own experience, but it delves deeply into questions concerned with a political theory of legitimacy. Why did you feel the need to address those foundational issues?
It's a really great question. After the crisis of 2008-2009, I became Deputy Governor of the Bank of England and was one of the main architects, actually, with the current Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, who had been my private secretary in the early 2000s, where we had discussed how we would reorganize the powers of the Bank of England if ever we had the chance. And suddenly we did. Or I did, Matt didn't. He'd left by then. And the incoming Tory government wanted to give the Bank of England a lot more powers, including returning some powers that it had lost in 1997 for essentially overseeing the soundness of the banking system, but in a much richer setting with many more powers. And various people towards the center of government wanted the Bank of England to have even more powers over financial markets. And I said no to those powers. And I was asked why, and I said because they would make us too powerful. That's Exhibit 1. Exhibit 2 is of the powers that we were given, they're quite broad. I mean, on the monetary policy side, it's price stability, whatever that is. We'll come back to that probably. On the financial stability side, it's a stable financial system, which is also vague. Now, on the monetary side, there's also, as well as the primary legislation, there's a secondary instrument that sets out the objectives in more detail. And the Treasury, the government, were planning not to have an equivalent specification of the objective on the financial stability side. And I said, but no, you must. You must give us a remit that comes from you, because otherwise we will be the people that decide high policy. And the third example, Exhibit 3, is there was a particular policy that the government were going to introduce, didn't come from us, around ring fencing banks. Doesn't matter what ring fencing banks is, except that it's a big idea that has to be implemented in great detail. And they wanted the Bank of England's new regulatory authority to spell out all of the detail. And Mervyn King, the governor, and I said, no. This policy is so vague that you must do the scaffolding. Yes, we can fill in the detail, but we mustn't decide what ring fencing means. You must decide what ring fencing means. And all of that was driven by a set of beliefs that we had about the place of a very powerful but unelected body in a constitutional democracy. And what I wanted to do when I left was articulate, so what's going on in the background? And can I actually articulate what's going on in the background? As it happens, I then discovered that away from economics and a little bit of political economy, in truth, very few people in academia had written about independent central banks at all. I mean, to give one example, there's a vast literature in US public law about independent agencies, but none of it is about independent central banks, even though they are the canonical independent agency. And so I found myself wanting to do something which hadn't really been done before.
So that's very interesting, and I want, if I may, in a few minutes' time, to come back to that question of vagueness and mandate specification, because I think that's one of the really important issues in this debate. But I really want, if I can, before that, to ask you a little bit about why the Republican turn, if I can put it that way, because I think a striking thesis of the book is that you say, well, neither interest group liberalism, I mean the idea that groups just bargain with one another to some sort of equilibrium, nor the idea of constitutional liberalism, the idea that it's adequate just to have procedural safeguards without any substantive safeguards. I mean, your argument is that neither of those are sufficient to really legitimate independent agencies. And you invoke Republican principles of contestation in the public forum. So why this turn to republicanism?
So there are two things going on here. One that's about republicanism itself, which I'll come on to in a moment. But the first is a kind of broader thing. So the way many arguments of this kind operate is they sometimes start off with, I have this view of what human nature is, or alternatively, I have some view of which moral theory is the right moral theory, utilitarian or deontological or whatever. Or I have some view of how democracy is properly grounded. And I'm going to deduce from that view a whole set of prescriptions about the structure of our governing institutions. And I think that's a mistake. And I instead, and I think it's a mistake because this is a kind of purely normative view of legitimacy that doesn't connect with sociological views of legitimacy. And here in the background is a kind of Bernard Williams type realist political theory where, as I would articulate it, the sociological account of legitimacy and the normative account of legitimacy can't be divvied up. Now, once one takes that step, then it matters which deep values are held by different people in different degrees across our political societies. And liberalism and constitutionalism certainly are one, but so is republicanism. So it's not just that I think that republicanism happens to have really important things to say, which I happen to think it does, but also that I'm absolutely sure that there's a significant part of society that thinks republicanism has important things to say, even if they wouldn't necessarily know the word republicanism. Now, on the substance, the essential point about republicanism is this. So why would one delegate anything to a body like an independent central bank? Well, essentially, it's to do with commitment. We as a political society want to commit to something, if we do, like price stability, low and stable inflation. And let's assume that's a good thing for the time being. And so we delegate it because although the politicians really believe in it, they're going to get tempted to depart from it because they have elections to win, whereas the person it's being delegated to doesn't have elections to win, but they can maybe accrue some esteem from fulfilling a mandate. So I'm sketching the idea of the importance of commitment, and actually commitment runs through politics. In a sense, law is a commitment device, so that the ruler doesn't turn up each morning and say, well, here are the rules for today. There'll be another set tomorrow. Or in fact, there are no rules at all. Here's what I want. Here's what's going to happen to you. So commitment is kind of deep in in proper politics, actually, and committing to, sometimes we can only commit to things by delegating them. So one way of thinking about this is, but if we have anything like a Republican view, then actually we want to be committing to the people's purposes. Not just that I, the king, think this is a good thing to commit to actually the people who make up the political community think it's a good thing to commit to. And once you get that far, then it's no good on a kind of Schumpeterian view that somebody won an election and they happen to want to make the Bank of England independent, or there can be sufficient consultation that, you know, kind of bargaining over regulations over banking that have been delegated. Instead, one wants a process that at the point of delegation involves the people more, because essentially one is trying to track their wishes. It's whether they wish to commit and bind themselves to the mast that really matters.
So I think that sets out very clearly why Republican concerns might be behind some idea of credible commitment and so on. But I think this does bring us back rather nicely to this question of the vagueness of mandates. I mean, you said before that at one point the Bank of England was being asked to take on something with no mandate at all, so to speak, no specification. But even a specification like price stability is an open-textured specification. And one could say, I suppose, that critics of independent central banks have really wanted to say two things. One is that when that idea of price stability gets decontested, when its ambiguity is clarified, it tends to get decontested in a way that favours certain sorts of interests, certain sorts of political programmes as against others. And there is this phenomenon of what you might think of as mandate contraction. So here I'm thinking of the US Federal Reserve, which, I mean, as you will know, has both an unemployment objective and also a price stability objective. And some people have said of that, well, if you actually look at the way in which the Federal Reserve operates, the price stability objective has tended really to dominate over the unemployment objective. So how far does the phenomenon of delegation to independent agencies suffer from the flaw that there is, so to speak, a vagueness in the mandate, which allows too much wiggle room, too much room for discretion?
So I think this is a major issue. I mean, I separate my principles for delegation into criteria for whether to delegate at all, and then design precepts for how to delegate. And the very first of the design precepts are: don't do that. Don't have a vague objective. Have an objective which is monitorable, so that we can see, we, the people, if you like, or those of us that are interested, can see whether the delegatee is achieving what they're meant to be achieving. So in the UK, on the monetary policy front, I think this is done rather well. So the government, the Parliament sets price stability as an objective for the Monetary Policy Committee, and Parliament says to the Treasury, thou shalt produce a remit fleshing out what is meant by price stability and how it should be traded off against other things. Actually, the then new Labour government in 1997, 1998 took real care over this. And what matters for these purposes initially is it says target an inflation rate of 2% defined in the following way. And the great thing about that is that anybody in the country can find out whether 2% is materially below, inflation is materially below 2% or materially above 2%. And it also avoids the 9 members of that committee going into the room with a different definition or notion of what price stability means. Where actually on the committee itself, when you're disagreeing with somebody, you can't really tell whether you're disagreeing about the objective or whether you're disagreeing about the outlook for the economy. Instead, that's answered. The objective is 2% over some period. Then there's a point about kind of mandate creep. If you have a vague objective, can the independent authority just do more and more and decide high policy? And what I believe is both normatively and in terms of prediction, is where that occurs, it's just not sustainable. And it will look sustainable as long as it goes fine. And when it doesn't go fine, when it goes badly, as it is bound to occasionally, people will say, this comes back to the Republican theme, what on earth's going on? We can't vote them out. No one could vote me out. I had tenure, and that was the whole point. Because otherwise I couldn't be trusted. If I was running for election, I wouldn't have been able to commit to the objective that we had been given. But it means that kind of ongoing contestation, if you like, public debate about whether we like the regime or not is important. And there's a kind of delicate balance here. On one hand, this is the political society actually trying to commit. So it can't be having that debate every day. On the other hand, if it never has it, then it's just kind of parceled it off to a bunch of people, and they can do what they will with it because no one's taking any notice. And so I think this fits with liberal as well as Republican notions of politics. I think that the sessions in front of parliamentary select committees are incredibly important. We thought, when I was there at the Bank of England, we thought that they were the most important occasions in our public accountability, because it kind of forced us, if you like, to explain what we were doing in language that we hoped could be comprehensible to the public, because we were communicating with the public's representatives. And we were once asked, and maybe this is a good note on which to kind of bring this part of the discussion to an end. We were once asked by a man called George Moody, who was what the Americans would call the ranking member. He was the senior Labour Party member on the committee. What's the point of all of this, Mr. King, Mr. Tucker? He said, we'll say all of these things and you'll just go back and do whatever you were going to do anyway. And we each gave more or less the same answer, which is, well, you know, that may or may not be true, but it's our duty to decide what we think is the right thing, so long as you maintain the delegation and primary legislation. And these occasions are to help you to decide whether or not the regime is worth keeping.
So I suppose one difference then, I mean, between the account that you've given of central bank accountability in the UK and what one might think of as interest group liberalism, is that interest group liberalism is about bargaining. And I think you're talking about something that's a bit more high toned than that, which is something like deliberation. It's really trying to think through something in the common interest.
Yes.
It's a fascinating conversation.
But
I mean,
real,
I'd love to obviously
not kind of the obscure Rawlsian deliberation where the Supreme Court is the ideal, but real public debate.
Yes, it's what I think Aristotle would call practical reasoning. I mean, it's taking into account the specifics of the circumstances as well as general principles.
Yes.
So one final question, if I may, which is about the international dimension, or perhaps one might say lack of international dimension of this, because republicanism is a theory that, on differing accounts, was true of classical Rome, but certainly true of the Italian city-states, arguably of the United States at various points in its history. But it is very much tied to the idea of a bounded political community, a public that deliberates together and decides its common good. And I know you're working on questions of international governance and so on. What does this mean in an internationally interdependent economy, in which what happens in one sector of the economy, as we saw 2008, you know, when Lehman Brothers went down, you know, that sent shockwaves around the world. What do you think these principles amount to in an international context? And I mean, we know within the European Union, for example, the European Central Bank's mandate and standing and actions have been incredibly controversial from both sides. I mean, some people saying it's been too tough, some people saying it's not been tough enough.
This is an extraordinarily powerful question, because I think the ground shifts a bit in a somewhat uncomfortable way. I mean, if one thinks about, my book sets out quite a delicate, elaborate argument for delegation within the state, but it takes for granted that it is a healthy constitutional democracy that is doing the delegation, or some organ in the healthy constitutional democracy. And so there is a sense of a political society.
Yep.
That's a given. Once one moves to the international realm, and a certain tribe of international relations scholars, English school scholars, talk about international society. One of the things I do in my new book, I don't want to say too much about my new book yet, but is I say, well, actually, this won't do. This is too monolithic. We need to distinguish between kind of thin society, a kind of good faith, and keeping formal promises when we enter into formal promises, through a kind of thicker society where we might subscribe or share responses to certain horrors. X is cruel, X should not be allowed, but with different deep reasons to that. And then finally, a kind of deep society where, if you like, the underlying deep doctrine is shared, not just in an abstract way, but in terms of almost a way of life. And where this kind of leads me is that what's feasible, by which I mean what is sustainably legitimate in the international realm, and how much you can pull power and how much you can delegate power internationally, depends on the kind of degrees of thinness or thickness of whether one's a political society at all. I mean, just to kind of connect this a bit to Brexit, and this point doesn't turn on any particular version of Brexit. I think of France, which has an incredibly strong tradition of its own version of Republican values, of having kind of reconfigured its basic legitimation principle to the Republic in Europe.
Yes. Yes.
And I think what Brexit has been about, in a sense, is could the local deep society legitimation principles of England, mainly, kind of adapt to a system where actually there is a higher legal order? And the answer was no, or not yet. And so I think, but this is a long-winded way of saying that as soon as one steps into the international arena, there isn't the idea of a political society can't just be taken for granted. Although I do think, along with your colleague Richard Bellamy and many others, that the starting point has to be about states and peoples, and not some kind of cosmopolitan perfectionism in which the state can just be ignored, and what matters is the individual person. Individual people, of course, they matter hugely, but that I feel safe when I go out of here for a walk, that is not delivered to me by some international community, but by the state in which this particular place happens to be based.
And of course, going back to your point about commitment, I mean, in a way, it's only states that have the power to commit their peoples. I mean, that's
Yes.
You can't have a random collection of people making a commitment because they simply lack the authority and legitimacy.
No, that's of course absolutely right, but it connects with something else, which is easy for us in Britain to overlook, although it's a bit true even of Britain, which is many states in the world can maintain internal security and order and safety and conditions for cooperation for their people, but can't actually provide an assurance of external security without help from a greater power. So a Republican principle that comes back, I think, is, and does that greater power provide security services, if you like, in a dominating way, or in a way where I, as a citizen of a weaker state, think, actually, yeah, this is quite a good idea, actually. They provide some protection, and we spend less on the military and either more on leisure or more on shopping. But the idea of domination comes back, although I think one has to be very careful with that. There are people within the Republican scholarship tradition that have tried to turn that into a particular political program. And one of the things I think is interesting about republicanism is that it has really important things to say, whether one is basically kind of at the social democrat or socialist end of the political spectrum, or at a kind of more liberal, kind of moderately conservative end of the spectrum. I'm actually not at any of those points, so I find this quite easy to identify.
Well, I won't go into the exploration of your personal commitments, and this is a conversation, obviously, which we could carry on. But I'm extremely grateful to you for this. You've raised very many important issues, and I think what's come home to me, as I expected it to do from your book and previous conversations that we've had, is this centrality of the idea of getting one's thinking about norms right before you start thinking about policy and institutions. So I'm extremely grateful to you for that. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Albert. It's been a real treat to be invited on here.
Thank you.